Have you noticed? Here on the internet, Bernie Sanders is everywhere.
Wall Street, and Wall Street. Are you ready for a fight?
This matters because in the betting for who will be the next president, Donald Trump, the incumbent, leads, but among Democrats, Senator Sanders is among the top 4.
Thank you all very much. Let's go forward together.
And most people don't know that Sanders has quietly built a digital media empire. That means he's in competition with me, and he's winning. His videos come out every few hours, and they've been viewed almost 1 billion times.
You are talking about oligarchy.
Many of his videos are just him ranting about how Republican ideas hurt people. Here he claims that the repeal of Obamacare will kill Americans.
Tens of thousands of them will die.
He ignores the thousands who may live if the economy is allowed to grow.
Oh, shut up, silly woman, said the reptile with a grin.
Other Sanders videos are edited, produced propaganda pieces.
You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in.
Here, Sanders' staff runs a Trump speech where Trump quotes a song about a woman who takes a snake into her home and the snake then bites her. Trump uses it to take an unfair, mean-spirited swipe against immigrants while arguing for tighter immigration controls. Sanders has every right to criticize that. But then he runs a clip suggesting that the president calls all minority immigrants animals.
Animals.
This is the same kind of language that the Nazis used.
But the video never mentions that Trump's animal comment was about the MS-13 gang. Another consistent theme in Sanders' videos is that lots of people on the right are horrible, greedy people who scheme to get more money, in this case by abolishing the estate tax.
The death tax.
The death tax.
A death tax?
They claim repeal will save Trump $4 billion.
When we talk about a rigged economy,
he doesn't mention that the estate tax taxes money that was already taxed. It's double taxation. He could still argue against repeal, but he ought to be fair.
I can't go to school because they're not paying me my fair share.
Many Sanders videos demand that he make college free because it's just too expensive.
Not just one or two people out there who are saying like, oh, I can't afford to go to college. This is like the majority of college students.
His staff interviews themselves.
Student loans have really kept me from being able to do things like purchase a home.
Again, there's no mention of how existing tuition subsidies already increased the price of tuition. And there's not a peep about how his own wife's shady financial dealings bankrupted a college. It's just government must pay more.
The cost of education is just incredibly high, and somebody has to fit the bill. The government should assume that responsibility.
Government should take responsibility for your health care, too, says this video, which describes MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi as a Canadian capitalist.
Nowhere on the face of the earth is there a free health insurance market that works. Let's actually bring back affordable insurance for working-class families. There was never affordable insurance.
This is billed as a debate, but Republican Jim Jordan hardly gets to say anything.
It's just one of those areas that a free market doesn't work.
It's easy to win an argument if you never let the other guys speak.
Almost all new income and wealth is going to the top 1%.
Probably the biggest theme in Bernie videos is income inequality, which Bernie says
is not only immoral, it is causing massive suffering.
But he's just wrong. The wealth gap doesn't cause suffering. Yes, rich people got richer, but the poor and middle class got richer too. Bernie never says that.
and the poor are getting poorer.
Sanders posts a new economically ignorant video most every day. He says it would be easy to have free health care, free college, a living wage. How will it be paid for? Simple. Raise taxes.
Tax me. Please, please tax me.
Sanders says the responsible rich want to pay more.
I should be paying more in taxes.
So pay more. No one's stopping you. Or give to charity. Charities will spend your money better than government will. Socialists think government's a solution to every problem, and they pretend that what government provides is free.
Free education, universal health care, a living wage.
Bernie's videos would be just a joke, except millions of people watch. And lots believe the nonsense he preaches.
We look at these figures and we say, oh, unemployment is low, everything is fine, right? Well, unemployment is low because everyone has 2 jobs.
What? That's not how unemployment works. I don't know if she learned that from Bernie, but Senator Sanders is the king of economic ignorance.
The top 10% gets it all. Gets it all.
And 1 billion people watch. You should know about that. We'll watch, so you don't have to.
Well, what empires do is they take people's territory, and then they dictate the conditions under which they have to be imperial subjects. The United States has not taken anybody's land since 1898 in the Philippines. And what's even stranger is that just the time we were being called imperial, we're getting out of everywhere. Took every troop out of Saudi Arabia. We're trying to take 40,000 troops out of Germany. That was very funny because while Mr. Schroeder was calling us an imperial power, his own mayors from German cities were in the Pentagon begging us to stay. I was always amused by that sign when we left the Philippines. There was a big sign by the crowd that says, "Americans go home, and take me with you." So there has never been an idea that we were going to go take somebody's land. A lot of Americans died in Okinawa, and what did? We gave it back to the Japanese, willingly. We gave, as someone said, we took the Panama Canal fair and square by stealing it, and now we've given it back. That's not a trait of an imperial power. We fund 25% of the UN. And yet if you look at the UN declarations or the resolutions, 48% of them that have been proposed have been against our ally Israel, and we are always condemned. And yet the United Nations is on American shores, and we pay the largest contribution for its budget. Again, politically, economically, culturally, there's nothing imperial in our veins. Which brings me to the one thing that all empires do. They have a militarily sophisticated system that's in service to imperial aggrandizement. But our wonderful military just doesn't fit that definition. If you wanted to look at some of the sharpest critics of the Iraqi war, who were they? Wesley Clark and General Zinni, generals of all people. If you look at the percentage of the budget that the United States devotes for military preparedness, it doesn't seem like any empire in history. The Athenians probably spent 25% of what we know of their gross domestic product. The Romans even more. The Germans and the Russians, 25-30%. Britain may have spent a lot smaller amount, but it was only because they really didn't have a navy for most of their an army for most of their imperial tenure. The United States only recently has got up to 4% of the GDP is spent on defense-related matters. 1950, 70% of all non-discretionary funds were spent on the military, and 30% were spent on domestic. People weren't talking that we were an empire. Then now they are, and we spend exactly the opposite ratio. 30% of non-discretionary federal dollars on defense, 70% on entitlements and domestic spending. Look at what the U.S. military has done lately. It's not just that they've closed bases in places like Saudi Arabia and Germany, and they're trying to reduce their role in Korea. They've done very strange things. They went into Grenada and took out a totalitarian communist and left a democracy. Imperial, maybe, but that's not what empires usually do. They went and took out Noriega, they left a democracy. They went in and bombed a Christian country in the heart of Europe, Mr. Milosevic, and tried to start a democracy. They took out a fascistic, theocratic country in the Taliban, and they tried to start a democracy. Whatever your opinions are about Iraq, when we went in, everybody said no blood for oil, and the price of oil was about $38. It's $70 now. So we have this tendency of an empire often removing fascistic dictators after the Cold War and then creating democracies which are not always friendly to us. And the locus classicus, of course, is the '91 Gulf War. Here we were sitting on the top of a quarter of the world's oil reserves. We didn't even remove Saddam, and we turned over the 19th province of Iraq, the former Kuwait, to the Kuwaitis. And what did the first thing the Kuwaitis did? Over our objections, they ethnically cleansed every Palestinian. That's an important thing to remember, because right after 9/11, the Kuwaitis polled the highest anti-American sentiment of any country in the Middle East, and when they were asked why, it was the U.S. treatment of the Palestinians. This is a country that was saved by us and ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, and it's a touchstone to understand why people allege that we're an empire. It's not empirical, but as we'll see, it fulfills a deep psychological need in a lot of people. But it's not just enough to say that we don't do bad things and we're not an empire. We do a lot of good as the world's most influential power. As we speak, we're trying to have 6-party talks in Korea. China's Klein has gone nuclear. If we were to pull in our horns and leave, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that Japan would go nuclear to protect its interest. It would build 4,000 nukes within a year, and they would work. They would work like Toyotas and Hondas, not North Koreans. Taiwan would go nuclear. South Korea would go nuclear. And you would have a real arms race. If we were to withdraw from the Middle East, Iran will go nuclear. And perhaps Saudi Arabia would go nuclear in response. And perhaps Syria would go nuclear. If we decided that we would withdraw from Europe, remember, had a utopian agenda that said it didn't need any defense anymore. And then they ended up with Milosevic. And who did they call? Us. And what was the result? Mr. Milosevic was gone in 7 weeks after he killed 250,000 people under the noses of the Europeans. And what was their reaction? We bombed. We're an empire. We were wrong to save them from Milosevic. The question then is, what are we if we're not an empire? Well, we are the most influential, military, powerful, democratic state in the history of civilization. Now, why did that happen? It didn't happen because we had a bunch of imperial planners in the rooms of the Pentagon. It happened for 2 reasons. The first, our founding fathers created in 6 or 7 pages what the Europeans cannot do in 1,000. They created this unique balance of power that protects property, guarantees individual rights, creates a mechanism for evolutionary liberal progress. It's turned into the most egalitarian, multiracial society in the history of civilization, and because of that, it exercises influence in culture, politics, economics, more than all of the rest of the planet put together. We take more immigrants into the United States than more countries put together. The second reason that we are so powerful is an artifact of the Cold War. Remember that we were isolationists in the 19th century. And what happened? We went into the 20th century, we went to World War I, and we got involved late, but in a fashion that was decisive, and we saved Western liberal democracy from Prussian totalitarianism. And what happened after that? We withdrew, and we had another European war in 20 years. The German army was not defeated. It gave up in foreign territory. It went right back and said, we never lost. So we were back in Europe, and this time we did not leave. But we stayed on to protect Europe from the new threat of the Soviet system that meant an end to all we had accomplished in the 20th century. And so after the Soviet system collapsed, we were faced with this choice. You want to be isolationists and go back home as you did after World War I and leave Nazism to be the next peril? Or do you want to stay engaged after you did World War II and defeat communism? So unlike the Europeans and others, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we did not disarm. We cut back on our defenses during the Clinton era quite substantially, down to about 3.5% of GDP, but we stayed on. And in a bipolar world, one side quit and collapsed. And that is not going to be written in stone. As we speak, again, the Chinese, who are adapting our system, finally, and given up on the Mao communist revolution of open markets, a capitalist system, a method of investment, private property, are finding the same success that we have. And given the rules of the system we created, they will be as powerful because they have 1 billion people, and people in 20 years will be talking about the Chinese empire. But believe me, unless they become democratic, they will not treat people in the Middle East when they want oil the way that we do. Watch out for that, because it's going to be probably a real empire unless it becomes democratic. Let me just recap it a bit. Nothing in our political, economic, cultural, or military behavior or protocols is anything resembling empires of the past. We do far more good than people give us credit for, which leaves us with a question. Why do people at this time in this age say that we are imperial? And if you scan almost all of the titles of books, magazine articles, op-eds that allege we are imperial, they have one common denominator. They're almost all critical of the United States. Nobody says we like the United States because they're imperial. So the ideas are synonymous. But let's be very careful and focus on who is calling the United States imperial. It's not 1 billion Indians in India. They are more than happy that the United States, at great risk to the economy, to people like you in the audience, allowed outsourcing, and you allowed free trade, and you created an entire new middle class in India, and they just polled 76% of those in India, 1 billion people, a fifth to the sixth of the planet, are pro-American. They're not the Japanese. The Japanese really do know the difference between a country with imperial aspirations like China and us, and they are desperate to have good relations with the United States. They're not the Eastern Europeans. They don't think we're imperial. They know what an empire was and who saved them from that. They're not even all of the Europeans. If you look what's going on in Scandinavia and Holland and Denmark, they know what empires in the past have done to them when they go across the Rhine. So let's be honest. Who are the people in the world today that are alleging that the United States is an empire contrary to all the empirical evidence that we discussed? They're basically just three groups. The first is the Middle East. Aside from the fact that the Middle East shows no gratitude. After all, it was the United States that bombed a Christian country to save Muslims over the objections of almost everybody in the world. For all the rhetoric of bin Laden, he did nothing to save his own Muslim brothers in Bosnia. We got nothing but criticism from the Middle East. We saved Kuwait, a Muslim country, from Saddam Hussein. We were the only country in the 80s and the 90s to criticize the Russians over their treatment about Muslims. We tried to save the Muslims in Somalia from starvation. Why is there no ingratitude? It's very simple. Because of the 22 countries in the Middle East, none until recently were democratic. Only Iraq has that potential. Only Iraq has that potential. And with the globalization movement, which they associate rightly with American popular culture, for the first time, people in the Middle East, when they turned on an internet on their computer, when they looked at a DVD, when they had a satellite dish, they knew that life was worse in Damascus than Paris. They knew life was worse in Cairo, much worse in Cairo than it was in Seoul. They knew life was much worse in Baghdad and Tokyo. And they had no method of expressing that anger on the Arab street. In a censored, dictatorial, and autocratic Middle East, they had no way to address those problems. The leaders did not want to take the tough measures that other people who had done in South America and Asia to find success. Don't discuss polygamy. Don't discuss gender apartheid. Don't discuss religious intolerance. Instead, make a devil's bargain with right-wing, fascistic Islamic terrorists to blame two people, the Jews and the United States, for all of this self-induced misery, and they are a powerful anti-American bloc. And you hear most of the United States being a pernicious empire emanating from the Middle East. There's one other group, and that is Western Europe, and specifically Germany and France. These really were imperial cultures. They really were. If you ask the Danish or the Dutch or the Poles, what was Germany like in World War I, or what was Germany like in World War II, or what was France like under Napoleon? These were grand imperial cultures that invaded and took what they wanted. And now they don't do that. In fact, they're very angry that their influence in the world has been curtailed by whom? A multiracial, radically democratic, radically anti-aristocratic culture that brings everybody in the world here and succeeds by being antithetical, as all of our grandparents and great-grandparents knew when they came here, antithetical to Europe. They are angry. And they're angry now in a way that they were not in the 70s because of what? There's no longer 300 Soviet divisions on their border. So now they can say whatever they want without a defense because the United States won that war for them. And for the foreseeable future, and I emphasize foreseeable, because in their utopian postmodern world, a man like Milosevic was not supposed to come. Just like the Iranians were not supposed to have nuclear weapons 3 hours from Berlin. But when that happens, they pull in their horns for a second and call the United States. And there's one last thing why they're very angry and allege that we are imperial, because their system, their alternate strain of Western civilization, high taxes, statism, utopianism, pacifism, has led in record levels of unemployment, almost no growth, unassimilated minorities, and so that Europe is worse off at a time of peace than the United States is at a time of war. And that makes them angry, just like a teenager is mad at its parents because it wants to be independent, and yes, it wants to be dependent at the same time. There's one other group. Never in history has civilization seen a more affluent, leisured, and comfortable class than millions in Western Europe and the United States. I'm not talking about the people who get up 8 to 5 and work at a plant in Michigan or where I live that pick grapes every day. They don't talk about empire. But there's a large number of highly sophisticated, highly intellectual, well-informed people who understand that they are quite well off. And they do not believe they're quite well off for the reasons we discussed, because of this unique system that not just takes the world's resources, but gives the world things like chemotherapy and AIDS drugs and uses all of its wealth in a way that benefits most of mankind. They're angry because they believe that somehow what they have was not created but taken from somebody. But this is where it gets very interesting, because they're angry in a boutique way. They don't want to go down and live in Fresno. They don't want to put their kids in the public schools. They don't want to do that sort of thing that might take away the life of a tenured professor or a life of a Hollywood movie star. So what do they do in the abstract? In the abstract, they criticize the United States because it brings, let's be honest, enormous psychological relief for them at very little cost. Let me just finish by saying that any time somebody starts in on the United States as a pernicious empire, just remember it usually tells you almost nothing about America and almost everything about themselves. Thank you very much.
One of the countries that or one of the ancient civilizations that I find most fascinating is the Byzantine Empire. A lot of people maybe don't know, but they actually preserved Western civilization for a good 1,000 years. And if you go and see the walls in modern-day Istanbul, they're like 20 feet thick. So you can't help but wonder, was this country overrun from the outside, or did it crumble from the inside? And as a military historian and a general historian as well, that sort of confluence of threats from outside as well as threats from within, how do you see that at work on our walls of civilization?
Well, every great society has enemies, foreign and domestic, but the question is why at a particular time in their history are those enemies superior to them when they weren't in the past? Why does Rome, when it's only 1/4 of Italy in the Second Punic War, destroy Hannibal, who's an authentic military genius, and yet when it has 70 million people and 1 million square miles, it can't stop a thug like the Visigoths or the Goths? And the answer is there's something changes within. When you go to Byzantium, it's kind of an aberration. How did Western civilization, Christianity, survive in that hostile climate in the East for 1,000 years after the fall of the West? So that Black Tuesday is what we say in Greece today of May 29th, 1453. And I think the answer is that what kept Byzantium alive was not their material riches, but people believed in a transcendence. In this case, it was Christianity, the Hellenic language, and Western civilization. They didn't think it was perfect, but they thought it was better than the alternative outside the Byzantine Empire, whether it was the Seljuk Turks, later the Ottomans, the Huns, whoever they were. They thought they were better than the alternative, and they were willing to make enormous sacrifices and articulate that again and again. But when a society gets into a Howard Zinn mode, to quote one historian that's been in the news lately, and doesn't believe that the United States is not just not exceptional, but is no better than the alternative, then history's unforgiving. It kind of comes out of nowhere and says, if you don't believe that you're better than all alternative, nobody else will, and there's no reason for you to continue. And it has to be replenished psychologically. And so all of you in this room, we have a duty, each according to our station. Each day we have to say to ourselves, the United States is better than the alternative, and what in my own way can I do to remind people of that? And I'm not going to be silent about it. And then we have to have an element of the tragic hero within us. You know, we all love the Western Shane or the Magnificent Seven or High Noon, but they all have one theme, don't they? That the tragic hero says, I'm going to do the right thing, but by doing the right thing, people are going to hate me, and they're not going to even want me around when I've done the right thing. And so criticizing what's going on in this country is going to earn you wages that are very unfortunate, but if you don't want to earn them, then we're going to lose the country, it seems to me.
Now, during that great final battle for the heart and soul and the land of the Byzantine Empire, someone left a door open in the inner gate, which I think hastened the end of the battle in favor of the Turks. I get the impression that, in a sense, we are also leaving the door open in this country with our porous borders and the fact that we don't keep track of our visa overstayers. And you've written about this in Mexifornia, A State of Becoming, about sort of leaving the door open to our southern border and how we have millions of people who have not assimilated into our culture, and that in fact has an effect on the fabric of our nation.
Well, we've always had immigration. I'm reading a fascinating book by our prior speaker that's in galley proof that I'm reviewing, Michael Barone. It's an excellent book, and he tries to remind us the Irish, the Jews, Eastern Europeans, and there's much truth to that. But I think in the book he's worried, and perhaps all of us are worried, that for immigration to work in the United States, it traditionally has had to be legal. And we traditionally had to have a melting pot, and we traditionally had to believe in the powers of assimilation, integration, and intermarriage. And we've never had a proximate country with such a long 1,700-mile border, which is the sole source. There's a lot of reasons that can explain why Mexico, after 1970, started to export its people, but it wouldn't have mattered. It was in here, as you say, the door was open. Any issue that unites the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal and the Voice of Aztlan is a very strange issue. But they have one thing in common. It's not left or right, as you see with a Gang of Eight, Democratic or Republican, but it's elite versus the mass. The average people of all persuasions are skeptical, because if they're a worker, I talked to a Hispanic worker and he says, why does my leadership want this amnesty when for the first time in my life, I'm making $11 an hour. I don't want my wages undercut by people from Mexico. It's been terrible for American workers. It's the Democratic and La Raza elite want a unassimilated constituency that's replenished every year by 300,000 or 400,000 that ensures that demographics change and that they can be spokesmen for group grievances rather than individuals. People's character, their race will never be incidental to their character. It'll always be essential. If you keep bringing people in that can't achieve parity in one or two generations, employers, as I said, want cheap labor, access to it. And then they dress it all up with this utopian caring, when in fact it's one of the most amoral, uncaring phenomenon in the world. It's bad for American poor. It destroys the concept of the rule of law. If all of you have to file a tax return on a particular date, is that a negotiable phenomenon? Can you say, I sort of kind of would like to pay it, but I really don't want to, as if an immigration law or an IRS law is something up for discussion? Who is to say, when you start destroying the law or the sanctity of the law, that you can pick and choose which other laws people have to follow? And we've seen that already with the erosion of federal immigration law. So I'm worried about it, and I'm confident that if we would shut the border and we would deport the people who have committed crimes, who have just arrived in expectation of amnesty, and who are on public assistance, there would be still a majority that we could work with. We could give them green cards and have a path to amnesty. But when I look at this Gang of Eight bill, that's not what it's about. It's about a DREAM Act, but there's no UNDREAM Act with it. We're talking about giving people amnesty, but not one senator has the integrity to get up and said, I will give amnesty or a path of citizenship to person A, but person B is not going to get it, and this is why, and they're not going to get it first before I give it to A, because that's politically incorrect.
So, picking what laws we choose to enforce is really an assault on the concept of rule of law. And we talked a little bit backstage about some of the things that this administration has done in just ignoring the law, like, oh, the law says this, well, we're not really going to do that. And I'm thinking No Child Left Behind, I'm thinking immigration law, I'm thinking Obamacare. I mean, it's a relief in some ways that part of it's, going to be on hold for a year, but there's also, it speaks to the rule of law that, if you're executing the laws, you can't just say, hey, I don't feel like doing this.
Yeah, I think that's why the founding fathers, who were well-versed...
Victor, excuse me, before you take that rule of law question, can we get the texting slide? We're going to do the texting for some questions a little differently here.
Okay.
You're going to be able to see them go on the screen.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, if it was just up, forgive me, but there it is again. And text your questions with that code number. For both Arizona and Colorado, we're on an equal footing. And... we'll go to your questions in a few minutes, but this is a great one from Krista Kafer about rule of law. Excuse me, Victor.
Oh, go ahead and answer my question. I'll take the speaker's prerogative. We'll go first.
Okay. Well, I think when we look around, the law has become fluid, and this is exactly what the founders were worried about, because they looked at Athens versus Rome. Rome was a constitutional republic. Athens was ruled, 51% of the people thought on any given day, and right after the founders expressed these worries, we had the French Revolution and this idea of fraternity and egalitarianism enforced by what 51% of the people want. That's not constitutional or consensual government. And so what do we look at with this president? If Boeing wants to put a plant in South Carolina, the National Labor Relations Board can try to shut it down. They can shut down a small guitar company. Don't enforce the individual mandate. Give 1.7 million people amnesty right before the election. So the idea again is that the law is not an abstract or a final or a legislative product, but it's predicated critical legal theory on what 51% are perceived to want and purposes of social justice. So if Eric Holder thinks that the Black Panthers may or may not have disrupted a polling booth, it won't matter, because their aims are egalitarianism and fairness, and they have a history of oppression, he thinks. Therefore, the law is secondary. And that's what, same thing with the Trayvon Martin case. A judge, I know I'll be in a little bit of controversy here, but the proverbial culpable white male was not involved in that case. There was somebody of mixed Latino heritage in an altercation with an African-American adjudicated by an all-female jury overseen by a female judge, and yet the politicalization turned that into a sort of racial issue when it was not. And the idea of a president commenting as that trial was going, it hadn't even been adjudicated, and after it was being adjudicated and it was subject to a civil rights investigation, then to comment again about the appearance. I think all of you would be shocked if Bill Clinton had said right in the middle of the O.J. trial, wow, Nicole Simpson looks like the second daughter I never had. That would be horrible to say that, because it would influence the jury. And so we're seeing things in the law that we haven't seen.
Progressives are making plans to push Democrats further to the left than they have ever been. A Washington Post poll conducted in January this year showed 51% of the country now supports socialized health care. That's crazy. Except look at the Democratic number. 3/4 of the Democratic Party now support it as well. 3/4. The party leadership is lining up in wave after wave, pledging their support. And people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, they're all going to pile in here in the next few years. Socialism used to be something that only extremists talked about, but now their message is mainstream and supported by a vast majority of the country. So last month, a shadowy group of progressive donors met in Florida to talk about their progressive path to victory. It was called Way to Win 2022 Victory Party. The notable attendees were the current DNC chairman Tom Perez and the former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe. Also, multiple U.S. congressmen were there. And the group organizing this is called Democracy Alliance. That sounds nice. We're going to do a whole week on these guys very soon. They are the Tides Foundation, just a newer version, funneling millions to progressive causes and groups on a massive scale. If they set the agenda, you can take it to the bank that the big names in the Democratic Party will soon be parroting those policies. According to their most recent conference, that agenda includes a single-payer health care, free college, and reparations. And so, in a nutshell, welcome to Venezuela. Oh, see now, I've revealed the magician's trick. That's the prestige they don't want you to see yet. They want to somehow or another convince you that something amazing is going to happen, just not Venezuela. But no matter how many times the president's girlfriends are paraded on TV or how many scandals they try and get you to click on and read, Venezuela is what you will always get. Remember, it was the same people that were praising Venezuela and saying it will never fall apart until it fell apart, and now you can't find them. But let me show you the reality in Venezuela. Over the last 60 days, the inflation rate has quadrupled. It is now at 18,000% and rising every day. If it continues at this pace, it's going to hit 100,000 by the end of the year. It's jumping 80% a month. Now let's put that into perspective. Our inflation rate is about 2.4%. Most healthy economies fluctuate high 1, low 2s. Nothing comes close to Venezuela. Now, you've heard the hyperbolic claims by American leftists. Here in America, we've got to do something because people are dying in the streets. But in Venezuela, they literally are. Last year alone, the average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds. Why? Because no one could afford food. I'm going to show you some video, and it could be disturbing to some, but you need to see it. People are so hungry and desperate for food that they are hunting down cattle with sticks and rocks. They have no food. So they are taking and stoning these animals to death just to get meat. They're at night looking for cats. They have eaten many of the animals at the zoo. They're eating dogs. And the supermarkets are empty. People stand in line for hours to draw cash from banks and even longer lines to buy food. But by the time they get there to purchase the staples like meat and bread and eggs, the daily inflation increase causes prices to double from what it was just a few hours prior, and they don't have the money. Now, President Maduro has responded, as is his standard operating procedure and the way progressives always do, by raising the minimum wage and printing more money. But this is pouring gasoline on a dumpster fire, and I'll show you why tomorrow. The current monthly minimum wage now in Venezuela is 2.5 million bolivars a month. Remember that number, 2.5. That's the average monthly wage. How much is 2.5 million bolivars? $2 a month. Could you feed your family on $2 a month? If not, we better start figuring it out, because this is the system that the new America left wants. And every single example where the government goes down this path, Venezuela is always the result. This is the actual price of socialism. But could your family afford it? Let's find out. Let's play The Price is Right, the Socialists edition. These here are current prices of staple markets in Venezuela right now. There's eggs, there's bread, and this may not be a staple in your family, but it certainly is mine, Hostess cupcakes. Now, keep in mind that your salary is $2 a month. You have to be frugal if you want to survive in the brave new world that socialism creates. The average cost of a loaf of bread in Venezuela now, remember, you make 2.5 a month, 2.5 million. This is $1 million more than you make a month. By the way, this is equal to about $3.80. There goes your entire monthly income and some for next. And for eggs, $3 million. You're still over. Now, you may never go for this, but I think this is worth every penny. How much are the Hostess cupcakes? $12 million. You're working 6 months to pay for the cupcakes. So what socialists say is, yeah, bread's going to cost a little more, but wouldn't you pay a little bit more if everybody got a loaf? I mean, there's only $1.20 more than we're paying in the States. Yes, except to get the socialist utopia, you have to go off a gold standard. You have to just start going crazy and printing money. That goes up, but the value of your money goes down. That is why Venezuelans are quite literally starving to death.
So the president, Chris Cuomo, challenged him about his thoughts on South Africa. Let's get an update from Lauren Southern right now. Hey, Lauren, how are you?
How are you?
Doing well. This is something that you've covered, and I believe we've had you on to discuss before.
Twice.
2 times. And you can find out more about Lauren and what she's covering with this stuff at laurensouthern.net. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. So what is going on in South Africa? Is it true that white farmers are having their farms taken from them?
Yes, it's insane to see the liberal media right now saying that Trump is a conspiracy theorist. This is all lies, because this is quite public knowledge. The South African government has said they're doing it. They've started seizing their first couple hundred farms. Now, what the liberal media are trying to spin it as is they're saying, oh, the government, first of all, they're saying this is in the Constitution, so it's allowed. Yes, you can amend your country's laws to do any number of horrible things. You can amend your country's laws to say Jews aren't humans or white land can be taken, right? So they just amended the laws to say we can steal from white people. And that is what is occurring in South Africa. And I'm so glad that Trump has called this out, because the UK government said, we need land reform. Every other government has been completely silent on this topic because they are afraid of pissing off the South African government, which it shouldn't matter. What they are doing is unethical. We should call it out. Any nation that believes in property rights and not discriminating against people's skin color should call this out.
Well, the thing is, Lauren, this isn't new. This didn't just start happening a week ago. They've amped it up. But this goes back a decade when they started doing this stuff. Right. So when Mandela came in, he said the goal was they wanted to take land from white people from the start. They wanted it to be a nation where mostly the Bantu people own the land. But what's crazy is Mandela at least said they wanted to compensate white farmers for the land. So the current ANC is even more radical than what communist Mandela was proposing for the policy, because they aren't giving any compensation at all. They're just stealing the land from these farmers. Now, are they injuring the farmers?
Well, this is something that is a little more controversial to talk about. The land issue is 100%. We know they're stealing land from farmers based on their race. The other side to this is there are farm attacks going on against South African Boer white farmers constantly, where they are being tortured, raped, just horrific things. And a lot of this comes from the rhetoric in the nation that everything is white people's fault. They deserve to be punished for the crimes of apartheid, even though, of course, it wasn't all whites that participated or created that system. And another thing that is very scary is there's a successful politician in South Africa, one of the second largest parties there, called the Economic Freedom Fighters, who has said, we don't quite want to kill whites yet, but no promises for the future. And he has sung songs about killing whites. He has said we need to cut the throat of whiteness. So, well, white farmers are not being killed yet. There are politicians that are elected in South Africa saying that may very well be the plan for the future.
Okay, so we have no proof yet. The reason I bring that up, obviously, is, you know, the president tweeted, I have asked Secretary of State Sec Pompeo to closely study the South African land and farm seizures and expropriations. Expropriation and the large-scale killing of farmers. South African government is now seizing land from white farmers. So killing of farmers.
It is a fact that there are a large-scale killing of farmers in South Africa. It's not confirmed whether it's the government facilitating it or not. But if anyone can look into it. One of the most dangerous jobs on earth to work is as a farmer in South Africa.
Okay, so give us an idea of how this is being laid out with them taking farms, because they've already taken some, and I imagine that more are coming.
Right. So right now, why the liberal media is trying to say this isn't a big deal is the first farms that are being taken are farms called fallow land. So it's land that's not currently being used. But if people know anything about farming, it's that you have to rotate where you are putting your crops. Otherwise, you will overuse the land and make it entirely unusable. So there are white farmers that are leaving their land fallow so that it will be healthy and they can plant crops there later. And then the government is just coming in and taking those. And this is an extremely scary thing because, first of all, I've been through the Bantustan farming areas. So these are the black tribal homelands. And most of the land there have these huge cracks and rivets in it from over farming. And that land is practically useless for decades afterwards. And the white farmers, the Boer farmers, as well as black farmers, they feed about 2,000 people per farmer. So you get rid of this fallow land from farmers, you give it away to people who don't know how to farm. Not only are you taking away a food source for thousands of people, but you are potentially damaging the land for decades afterwards by giving it to people who don't know how to farm it. And we know that the ANC are not going to be giving this farming land to expert farmers. They're going to be giving it to friends of their party. They're going to be giving it to political operatives. They're going to be giving it to people who are going to support them, because that's what this is. This is a policy brought in for votes, not to do something ethical.